Welcome to the Deep Dive. Look, we know you want to get a handle on the big historical shifts without getting totally bogged down in endless details.
Exactly. Information overload is real.
Right. So today we're diving into a really transformative era, 1450 to 1750, the age of transoceanic interconnections. Think of this as your fast track to understanding how the world, well, fundamentally changed.
hmm Our goal here is to pull out the core themes, what shifted, what stayed the same as global interactions ramped up.
Yeah, we'll hit the big stuff. Tech leaps, exploration, the whole Columbian Exchange thing, empires rising, societies changing,
Wow.
and people pushing back against state power.
And we're working from an AP World History Review summary, so it's really focused on those key concepts and developments, the main ideas.
Perfect. Okay, so let's unpack the core of this era. What really got things moving?
Well, what's so striking about this time is just the sheer scale of global interconnectedness that, suddenly emerges. It wasn't just about better maps.
No, definitely not.
It was a fundamental reshaping of, well, everything, biology, economies, cultures, all driven by more and more contact. Our aim is to really nail down the forces behind that change and the biggest impacts.
Absolutely. So how did this massive connection even become possible? It wasn't like Europeans suddenly became master sailors overnight.
Not at all. It was more about adopting and improving existing technologies. We're talking things like the magnetic compass, originally from China, gave sailors direction.
Right, and the astrolabe, maybe Arab or Greek for navigation.
Essential. And the lateen sail, thanks to Arab merchants, made ships way more maneuverable. Plus, astronomical charts drawing heavily on Muslim scholarship that built on Greek ideas, crucial for finding your way by the stars.
So these weren't European inventions per se.
No, largely adopted. They spread through those older networks, Silk Roads, Indian Ocean, Trans-Saharan routes. The Pax Mongolica, that period of Mongol stability, had actually helped spread some of these ideas earlier.
That's a great point. The world was already connected, just maybe not as rapidly across oceans.
Exactly, and then you see European innovations layering on top, especially in shipbuilding, designed for these new challenges.
Like the Portuguese caravel. Nimble, armed, good for exploring and sort of enforcing things.
And the carrack, also Portuguese, bigger, more cargo, more guns for dominating trade routes.
And then the Dutch came along with the fluid.
Ah, yes, the fluid. Super trade-focused, huge cargo holds, small crew needed, cheap to build. Really a game changer for commercial dominance. Each ship type played its part.
Makes sense. And this wasn't just, adventurous captains deciding to sail off. States were heavily involved.
Definitely. After the Black Death recovery, European monarchs were getting stronger, consolidating power away from the nobles, building armies, taxing more efficiently.
And they really, really wanted Asian spices. Pepper, especially. There's that quote, "Pepper is black and has a good smack." Tells you how valuable it was.
It does. And because existing land routes were controlled by established empires, making spices expensive, finding sea routes became, well, a state-level priority.
Portugal jumped in early. Their location helped, obviously.
Right on the Atlantic.
Right.
And Prince Henry the Navigator was key, sponsoring voyages. He brought together the tech, the shipbuilding, the economic pull, first trans-Saharan gold, then spices, and even a religious angle, spreading Christianity, looking for Prester John.
That mythical Christian king.
Yeah, that whole legend. So Portugal sets up this trading post empire, first down West Africa, then into the Indian Ocean after Vasco da Gama reached India. Their strategy was mostly controlling trade with armed ships at key spots, not huge land colonies initially.
Okay, so Portugal's focused on controlling trade routes. Spain, though, took a different path.
Kind of. Ferdinand and Isabella also sponsored exploration, but Columbus, sailing west, trying to reach the East Indies and hitting the Americas instead, that was a different outcome.
Yeah, just a bit.
And then Magellan's crew circumnavigating the globe for Spain. This opened up the whole transatlantic trade, which, the source material suggests, became even more lucrative than the Indian Ocean trade eventually. Spain was looking more towards conquest and establishing colonies right from the start in this new world.
So Portugal controls trade. Spain conquers and colonizes.
Broadly speaking, yeah. And their success naturally made other European powers anxious and envious.
Got to get a piece of the action.
Pretty much. Political rivalry, the desire for wealth, still looking for those routes to Asia. It pushed France, England, the Dutch to join in.
So you get France up in North America, Quebec, fur trade, Champlain dealing with the Iroquois.
England, after some false starts, sets up Virginia, Jamestown, figures like Walter Raleigh involved under Elizabeth I.
And the Dutch, they founded New Amsterdam, right?
Yeah.
Henry Hudson.
New Amsterdam.
Yep.
And they eventually elbowed the Portuguese out of the way in the Indian Ocean trade, largely thanks to those efficient flute ships we mentioned. So you see this pattern, competition driving expansion across the globe.
Which brings us right to the Columbian Exchange. This is huge.
Absolutely massive.
Yeah.
It's that transfer of diseases, foods, plants, animals back and forth between the eastern and western hemispheres, all set off by those initial European voyages looking for Asia.
And the impact was just staggering, especially diseases.
Devastating, particularly for indigenous Americans. Because they'd been isolated, they had no immunity to diseases like malaria, probably brought over by mosquitoes in ships carrying enslaved Africans, measles, and especially smallpox.
Smallpox that led to the Great Dying, right?
Yeah.
Catastrophic population collapse.
Yeah. Hard to even comprehend the scale.
But the exchange wasn't all one way, biologically speaking.
No, true. Europeans brought wheat, grapes, olives, plus things like bananas and sugar from Asia and Africa to the Americas.
And the Americas gave Afro-Eurasia things like maize, corn potatoes, manioc, or cassava, which our source notes really diversified diets and helped populations grow back east after 1700. Oh, and enslaved Africans brought okra and rice, too.
So a huge mixing of food crops. And this mixing fueled the rise of cash cropping in the Americas. You know, large plantations growing one main crop for export, often using coerced labor.
Sugarcane in the Caribbean is the classic example, isn't it?
Yeah.
Worked by enslaved Africans, shipped to Europe and the Middle East.
Exactly. Animals were a big part of the exchange, too. Pigs, sheep, cattle came from Europe, led to ranching, but also environmental problems like soil erosion.
And horses. Completely changed life for some Native American groups on the plains.
Absolutely transformative for hunting buffalo, for warfare.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Columbian Exchange, incredibly complex, huge consequences, many unintended.
Okay, so contact exchange. Then comes empire building. The motives seem pretty clear.
Gold, God, and glory, the classic trio, drove competition between European powers.
We touched on Portugal's trading posts, armed control of trade. Spain went for full colonies like the Philippines, using tribute, taxes, forced labor.
Right. And the Dutch largely replaced the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean, using similar tactics control through force. France was slower to make a big impact there initially.
Britain started with coastal trading posts in India, setting up for later.
Precisely. But it's important to remember, even with Europeans muscling in, those existing Indian Ocean trade networks didn't just disappear.
Oh, right. You mentioned that continuity.
Yeah, merchants from the Middle East, South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, Swahili Arabs, Omanis, Gujaratis, Javanese, they kept trading, sometimes even profited from the increased activity. They adapted.
Interesting. But not everyone welcomed the Europeans with open arms. There was resistance in Asia.
Definitely. Ming China, after Zheng Heling, his big voyages mostly turned inward, limited trade with Europeans, eventually kicked the Portuguese out of some areas.
And Japan.
Tokugawa Japan was open for a bit, but then got really wary of Christian missionaries and potential foreign influence fracturing their society. So they expelled the missionaries, cracked down hard on Christianity, and went into a long period of isolation.
So pushback and attempts to control European influence. What about in Africa? How did these networks affect states there?
Well, some African states actually grew stronger initially. The Asante Empire in West Africa traded gold, ivory, and eventually enslaved people with the Portuguese and British, getting wealth and power. They later used that strength to resist the British.
And the Kingdom of the Congo.
Down south, they had early diplomatic ties with Portugal, traded resources, including enslaved people. The king even converted to Christianity. It brought wealth at first, but the relationship became exploitative.
This leads us to the really difficult topic of slavery. You mentioned continuities and changes.
Yeah, slavery wasn't new in Africa or globally. There was existing slave trading. Sometimes slaves held positions of influence in the Islamic world. Assimilation happened.
But the transatlantic trade was different.
Hugely different. The sheer scale, for one.
Yep.
And the focus was overwhelmingly on brutal agricultural labor in the Americas, especially sugar plantations. It was heavily male-dominated, which wrecked demographics in parts of Africa. And crucially, it became intensely racialized chattel slavery, where people were property based on race, and it was hereditary. That was a profound and terrible change.
And European states actively managed their growing empires and trade. Mercantilism comes in here.
Right. Mercantilism was the dominant economic theory. The idea was that wealth, especially gold and silver, was fixed. States needed a favorable balance of trade export more than you import. Colonies were key sources of raw materials and captive markets for the mother country's goods.
Closed systems, basically.
Pretty much. And to finance all this exploration, trade, navies, they used things like joint stock companies.
Like the Dutch East India Company, or the British one.
Exactly. These were private companies, but chartered by the state, often given monopolies. Investors bought shares, limiting their personal risk if a voyage failed. It was a way to mobilize huge amounts of capital, different from the more direct state funding Spain and Portugal used initially. And this competition fueled wars, like the Anglo-Dutch Wars over trade routes.
Makes sense. But even with all this new global stuff, some older patterns continued.
Oh, absolutely. Regional markets within Afro-Eurasia stayed really important. Land routes like the Silk Roads didn't just vanish overnight, and most people were still peasants or artisans producing goods, though maybe now their cotton or silk was feeding into these bigger global networks.
But the changes were game-changing. The Atlantic system connecting the hemispheres.
Fundamental shift. Goods, wealth, and tragically enslaved labor moving across the Atlantic. Sugar was a key driver.
And silver. You mentioned Potosi, those mines in South America.
Yeah, massive amounts of silver flowed out of the Americas. A lot of it ended up in China, which had a huge demand for silver for its economy. Europeans used that silver to buy Asian goods, spices, silks, porcelain that they then traded within the Atlantic system. Silver really greased the wheels of global trade.
And all this was fueled by expanding coerced labor systems.
Yes, we talked about chattel slavery, but there was also indentured servitude, the Spanish encomienda and hacienda systems exploiting indigenous labor, and adaptations of existing systems like the Inca Mita, repurposed by the Spanish for mining. Various forms of unfree labor became central.
And the social effects. You mentioned demographics in Africa.
Right. Gender imbalances due to the slave trade changed family structures.
Hmm.
In the Americas, you saw cultural blending, new Creole languages emerging from the mixing of African, European, and indigenous peoples.
And belief systems. Christianity spreading.
Yeah, Spanish and Portuguese missionaries were very active in the Americas, trying to convert indigenous populations. This often involved imposing language and culture, using tools like the printing press. But results varied, some conversion, a lot of syncretism where indigenous beliefs blended with Christianity, and also outright resistance. Figures like Bartolomé de las Casas even argued for better treatment of indigenous people, though his impact was limited.
So expansion leads to empires. But empires always face challenges,
Right.
resistance.
Always. As states tried to centralize and expand their power, local groups pushed back. You see it everywhere.
Like the Pueblo revolts in North America.
Exactly. Against Spanish religious and economic oppression led by Popé, they actually drove the Spanish out for a while. A temporary success, but significant.
And in Europe. The Fronde in France.
Yeah, nobles rebelling against Louis XIV's growing absolutism and high taxes ultimately failed, but showed the tension. You also had Cossack revolts against Russian centralization. Pugachev's rebellion against Catherine the Great was a major one, brutally suppressed.
What about India?
The Marathas, a Hindu warrior group, fought a long guerrilla war against the Mughal Empire, especially under Aurangzeb, really weakened the Mughals over time.
And Queen Anna Nzinga in Africa.
Right, ruler of Ndongo and Matamba. She fought cleverly against Portuguese expansion for decades, even allied with the Dutch at times. A remarkable story of resistance.
And Metacom's war, King Philip's War in New England.
Another major example of indigenous resistance against encroaching colonists, in this case the English. Very brutal war, ultimately a defeat for the Native Americans, but showed their determination.
Resistance wasn't just from conquered peoples, but also from the enslaved.
Absolutely crucial to remember. Enslaved people resisted constantly. One major way was forming maroon societies, communities of escaped slaves, often in remote areas like mountains or swamps in the Caribbean and Brazil.
Places like Jamaica.
Exactly. Some maroon communities fought off colonial forces for so long they actually signed treaties recognizing their freedom, like in Jamaica in 1739 after resisting the British.
Wow. And outright revolts.
Yes, like the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina, also in 1739. Enslaved people rose up against harsh conditions. It was violently suppressed, but it terrified slaveholders and led to even harsher laws. It showed the constant potential for rebellion.
Alongside resistance, these empires were also creating new social structures, new hierarchies. How did they deal with ethnic diversity?
It varied a lot. You had the expulsion of Jews and later Muslims from Spain and Portugal after the Reconquista. Many Jews found refuge in the Ottoman Empire, welcomed by rulers like Mehmed II.
Contrast that with King China.
Right. The Manchu rulers imposed policies to maintain dominance over the majority Han Chinese, like forcing them to wear the Q hairstyle, so restrictive policies.
But then you have the Mughal Empire under Akbar the Great.
Much more tolerant, at least under Akbar. He abolished the jizya tax on non-Muslims, funded buildings for different religions, a very different approach.
And women's status
Right.
in the Ottoman Empire.
Also varied. Elite women, especially in the Sultan's harem, could wield significant informal political influence, but for most women, rights remained limited within a patriarchal structure. It wasn't uniform.
One of the biggest changes was the emergence of completely new social hierarchies, especially in the Americas.
Yes, the Spanish casta system is the prime example. A really rigid hierarchy based explicitly on race and parentage. At the top were Peninsulares born in Spain, then Creoles Europeans born in the Americas.
Then mixed race groups.
Exactly. Mestizos, European and indigenous ancestry. Mulattoes, European and African ancestry. Zambos, indigenous and African ancestry. And then below them, indigenous peoples and people of African descent occupied the lowest rungs. It was a whole new social order imposed by the colonizers.
While new elites were rising in the colonies, were existing elites in the older empires facing challenges.
Definitely. In the Ottoman Empire, the state gradually took control over Timur's land grants previously given to cavalry soldiers, which reduced the power of that military aristocracy.
And the Russian boyars.
Their power was seriously curtailed by czars like Peter the Great, who pushed absolutism. He basically abolished their old rank and forced them into direct state service, integrating them into his new system.
Similar trend in Europe with monarchs like Louis XIV.
Yes, the rise of absolute monarchs often meant reducing the independent power of the traditional nobility. Kings built centralized bureaucracies, professional armies, and drew power away from the old feudal lords.
Okay, so let's try to pull this all together. Stepping back and looking at 1450 to 1750. What's the big picture?
Well, the most obvious thing is that dramatic increase in global interaction, right? Maritime exploration, the Columbian Exchange, European empires reaching across oceans, it connected the world in unprecedented ways.
But some things stayed the same. Continuities are important too.
Absolutely. Agriculture remained the foundation for most economies, even with global trade growing. Traditional farming, peasant labor, even forms of feudalism like serfdom in Russia continued.
Major religions, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, kept their influence, adapting maybe, but enduring.
Right. And large land-based empires like the Ottomans, Mughals, King China, Russia, they continued, adapted, sometimes expanded, sometimes faced internal stress, but they were still major players. Patriarchy and social hierarchies also persisted, though they might morph where new ones emerge.
But the changes were massive.
Undeniable. The rise of maritime empires, European powers dominating sea lanes and large parts of the Americas. Truly global trade networks linking hemispheres for the first time.
The Columbian Exchange, transforming environments, diets, and especially demographics through disease.
That huge expansion and intensification of coerced labor chattel slavery becoming central to the Atlantic economy, indentured servitude, adapted forms of older systems, all increasingly racialized.
And new economic systems taking shape, mercantilism driving state competition, the beginnings of capitalism with joint stock companies.
Political centralization was a huge trend too. Absolute monarchies in Europe, powerful gunpowder empires consolidating control.
And colonization and imperialism, obviously. European dominance in the Americas, trading post-empires elsewhere, settler colonies creating new societies, often built on racial hierarchies.
It's a period of profound, often brutal transformation.
So this deep dive hopefully has given you that essential overview of this really pivotal era. We focused on hitting the main themes, the big shifts, the key continuities, without getting lost in, every single battle or treaty.
The goal was to see the connections, how tech enabled exploration, which led to exchange, and empire, which caused social change and resistance. It's all linked.
Yeah, hopefully you've got a clearer sense now of how intertwined all these developments were between 1450 and 1750. It really sets the stage for the modern world in so many ways.
It absolutely does. And thinking about this focus on the core ideas may be a final thought for you to consider. Reflecting on all these major shifts, the tech, the exchange, the empires, the labor systems, what single underlying force do you think most fundamentally shaped this era of transoceanic interconnection? That's something to mull over.